Welcome everybody. I hope that Sucharita has distributed this note, among everyone. And the time is, we don't have much time, so maybe I will raise few points. I will not read it out, but you know, uh, bring to your attention certain things that uh, I felt that maybe discussed a bit. So I shall speak for about 10-15 minutes and leave it to you, so that another 15 minutes we can discuss a little bit. Now, when we decided to work on the question of security, so given Indian condition, and we don't have to say much on it, in fact, we were expecting 2-3 more colleagues to join, and they could not for obvious reasons. And in any case, I also thought that given the fact that we are all in the age of security, so it's not that we can say that we do not like security. It's beyond your like and dislike. And if it is the case that the milieu of security is all enveloping, then how does a group or somebody working on issues of justice, human rights, and other related issues, how can they cope with the problem of security? And my basic point is that it is beyond good and evil. And the security question or the security problem is not a false problem. It is not that it has been conjured up by the state and we are all victims to it. That had been the, let us say, the expected, but that was the usual view of human rights activists, civil rights activists, till 20 years ago. But slowly, the whole problem of security as a great social question, as something that affects the entire society, affects intergroup relations, affects individual existence, affects women in society, children in society. This, my understanding is that this has dawned upon large sections of people. I mean, if you take an example of working women going back home from work, or we just passed one of the devastating epidemics. And public health has become not only a matter of right to health, but it's also a matter of security of life. Epidemiological security, health security, housing security. This year, in India, in Madhya Pradesh, I can't remember the exact figure, but it runs into more than 1,000. People died only due to heat. And we do not know how many people lost their livelihood because simply they could not go out to work. Shoboshachi was mentioning labor in platform economy, labor who work for platform economy. And for understandable reasons, in our mind, the idea of social security and the idea of security of state or national security, the idea of the security of life, these were all compartmentalized. And as I said, this was for understandable reasons. But certainly with neoliberalism and many other things, time is short, so I can't go into that, that the security of life has become, in a way, an overwhelming question. It doesn't mean that there are out there is a cluster of issues which can be described as questions of security of life, and there are other issues which can be described as security of work, etc., job security. Because this is a time when many issues suddenly transform themselves as life issues or life questions. So that is something that is very important. And what are the implications of this transformation of certain crucial issues as questions of security of life? That is something that, we have to think. The second point is something that Paula and I, when we were working together on question of migration and security, and this was as part of a work undertaken by WISCOMP, that we broached the question of the paradoxical nature of security, where the more you want to ensure security of the nation, the more you realize that there are insecurities below. And this is almost as if in a kind of inverse ratio. The more you have, let us say, overall security, the greater is the dimension or phenomenon of insecure people. And classic is the state of Manipur today. One doesn't have to tell how insecurities develop with certain administrative, legal, and political, military decisions which spawn off insecurity. Indeed, this whole structure of security is, and that's the second point, is paradoxical. There is no way you can ensure complete security, security of state, security of nation, security of our lives, security of the individual. It's not the security itself, and one doesn't have to be a rocket scientist to understand this contradictory nature, and as I said, the implications of this are important. Something again, and maybe I will bring in 2-3 points and then I'll stop. Something that also needs to be kept in mind, that there was at some point of time when we thought that security could be ensured if you could ensure peace. Or some people could have said that if peace is ensured, you have security. But on the other hand, now we think that unless we are secure, we cannot have peace. And this is so much in tune with the whole liberal notion of security, because if you think of the idea of security, security doesn't relate to something that has happened. Security is always anticipated. Meaning, as you know, you enter this hotel at night, or let us say at some point. Now, if someone has committed a theft in the hotel, what would you do? You would inform the reception would inform the police station, the police would come and Hopefully they will be able to identify the thief, and the thief will be booked. But then you think that what happens if another thief comes tomorrow? Do you install security cameras? This is what security anticipates certain danger. There is no notion of security that is not anticipatory. There is no notion of security that doesn't have an element of risk. It is the more we develop and the more we model our life along the line of risk, the more we tend towards fashioning and framing and realizing what may be called the apparatuses of security and the security camera, and one can go on and on to think, including investment in the market, where again you know that security means certain, it's a very technical word. The word security in market is a technical word in financial market. And you will see the more you think of it, it's all a game of thinking of a risk, anticipating it, and then framing certain apparatuses in order to ensure that. What could be the opposite of that? So long we had thought that rights was the way. And I'm not saying for a moment that rights is not the way. The rights revolution that took place in 70s and 80s was a very important thing. It was, though, in a way different from the period from, let us say, the passage of the UDHR by the United Nations to the ICCPR, and then the social and economic rights and the host of rights that we had. But then the more we thought of conflicts and the reality of conflicts became dominating, the question of trust came back. When we thought of rights, initially the rights agenda never took the element of trust as an important thing. But how do you create trust? And trust it's not a matter of trust between two individuals, but it's this total whole social, you may say, stock of trust. How do you create trust? And if you have trust, it's something that you have to nourish. You have to reproduce it. It's not that it remains in the exact shape or in the exact quantity in which, let us say, the trust has been there. And therefore trust has to be reproduced. How do you reproduce trust? And it's a collective process. So there are, and trust is exactly the opposite of risk. Because when you trust somebody, you know that it's not that you do not know there is a risk, but it is the obverse of our, when we trust somebody, we know that we have mitigated, or we have reduced, or we have negated the reality. And I think all these have been reinforced by the reality of COVID. But this is not unfortunate. Maybe this is the way society goes. That when the COVID was there, we thought that this was the biggest reality. This was a reality that we shall never forget. And now today, it's business as usual. Who thinks about COVID? Who thinks about what are the legacies or what are the burdens that we are carrying? If we say India, so we know that the death figures can be anywhere between, we do not know. Government figure is 500,000 or maybe little more, but non-government or international, and you can speak of the WHO figures. WHO figures are close to 3 million, but people say that it could be 5 million also. There are certain other very reliable statistical sources that say that probably 5 million people died. But if you think of the lessons of COVID-19, one of the great things, apart from any other thing, is that society is moving from a notion of a liberal, rights-oriented outlook to a much more care and protection-oriented outlook, where the crucial thing is not only, obviously, the right to get health is important, and nobody is saying that the right has become obsolete. But on the other hand, something that was there, but that has emerged and that has become important, and that shows that on one hand you have, if you think of the architecture of care, so on one hand you will see that half of it is corporatized as usual. There is a care economy, and we all know what care economy is all about. But on the other hand, if you think of the quote and unquote lower sections of society, the subaltern sections of society, you can see that care and protection work in a different way. And this is exactly opposite to the colonial history as well as liberal history. The famous historian David Arnold, and I will stop here, raised a question that in plague, let us say from 1890-95 to 1915, huge number of people died. And we recalled plague only in the wake of the Ahmedabad plague in the recent time, and then Surat plague, and then we recalled it, and all the plague histories were recalled when the COVID came. And it is said that 1/6 of the working population of India perished in the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 19. 1/6. Some people say it's government estimate, but some people say more. But David Arnold is asking, why is it that Indians have never talked about the immense loss of human lives and the complete insecurity of human life in the wake of the influenza epidemic? Why is it so? Why we never talk? And when India became free or independent, what was our first priority in public health? It wasn't plague, it wasn't influenza, but it was malaria. Why? Because in public mind, David Arnold's explanation is that it was malaria and the continuous nationalist campaign, Congress campaign on malaria, how British had ignored the rural misery, etc., etc. And it's not that malaria was unreal. So therefore there is something in public sense, there is something in the historical determination which decides our own conception or perception of what is the dominant risk. And therefore if we come back to my therefore last point, that what is important therefore is to understand that security, the notion of security in the public mind, and it's very important those who work with the people and among the people to understand that the notion of security is undergoing a great change. There is a great metamorphosis in the idea of security, and it's much more biological today. It is much more biopolitical. It is much more concerned with how people perceive to be a matter that concerns your life. That if people think our life is at stake, then they will decide. So what is security is decided in as much as by the rulers, in as much as by our political, national defense priorities. But please do not mistake that at the bottom there is a continuous wrestling, there is a continuous struggle, there is a continuous, you may say, tussle between the lower orders and the upper orders on the notion of security. The lower orders do not say that security is a false thing, but they would say that if security is the question, then have you ever thought of what is the security of my life? And it is particularly true with this line. I will end. I was telling somebody that I have a very good historian friend who has worked on the slums of Morocco and of Tunisia. No, sorry. And he was saying that he has written a history of some of the slums in Tunisia, in Tunis. And he was saying that the history of a slum in Tunis is nothing but a history of firefighting through the year. Why? Because these are all unauthorized settlements. These are all made of combustible material like plastic sheets and all that. On any occasion, on any reason, there is a fire in the colony. There is a fire in the slum. And immediately, as if the general has all laid out the roles of the front soldiers, foot soldiers, people know The young people will immediately rush with the water. The children there will be attempt to save the children, etc. That is the life which is continuously fighting against the insecurity. This is what the life of the lower orders is patterned on. So that is something that we must keep in mind, that when I say that the notion of security is now more and more life-oriented. I think these are few points that, and this is the reason why we say that security is something which stands at the crossroads of certain issues, whether they are justice, etc. Now, academics call it intersectionality. I do not want to go into that. In fact, I avoid that. Reason being that if you always speak of intersection as if it is an eternal principle, we are all intersectional. I'm sharing my life with Shobhushachi, and though he's not happy always, you'll perhaps think to a pardon, but he can't avoid me. So I will always say my life is, but it means the formulation loses its stake. On the other hand, the question is, what is at this particular juncture? What is this conjuncture? What is this precise moment that makes security a question that will stand at the crossroads of several things? There is a particular historical determinacy to the formation of a problem in society.
Thank you, Ranavidya. And Professor Shamadhar has already unpacked different dimensions of the notion of security stroke insecurity. And the floor is now open for comments and questions. Arugda.
So you have not juxtaposed, but contrasted that how the one kind of security, particularly the national security, produces insecurities, lot of insecurities at other planes, particularly in the lower planes. And you also hinted about the biopolitics, that how the population at the lower levels innovate and also guided by ethics of care to ensure their security. And you post this in your book, published around COVID times, The Politics of Life, where you counterpose the Foucault's the notion of biopolitics from above and to your notion of biopolitics from below. So that is one way of reading that, and you have also made a critique of rights and brought in the notion of care to address these complex issues. So I would just like to provoke you in the sense that when you are talking about the ethics of care and counterposing the biopolitics from below or politics of life, in contrast to the Foucault's notion of biopolitics. Can you bring the class question here, or that is a completely different language in addressing? Because it is you I am addressing this question or provoking you. That can you bring the class question back in addressing these issues, or both are completely different languages? Thank you.
Something which has always been a concern in the security-insecurity domain, but of late, for quite some time, over a decade or more than that, there is a clear apparatus where government or a particular regime clearly makes certain section subject to insecurity. Very clear, very obvious, direct. In that kind, though again, when we look at the class question, the poor, the proletariat, or whichever way we say, we have been hearing, we have been knowing, but identity based, religion based, and something like that, very obvious, clear, and we know the apparatuses of government, not hidden, not subtle, but obvious. In such situation of how does this insecurity is being perpetuated by regime who is supposed to be the duty bearers, is something which bothers us to how to handle or how to comprehend this question. And if you can throw some light on it, that would be great.
Actually, Manish's intervention makes me think the problem differently, in the sense that I was wondering if natural disaster actually makes a distinction between the rich and the poor, or for that matter, Hindus and the Muslims. In other words, can we actually think in terms of security, and particularly lower order security, as a transcendental experience, in the sense that it cuts across the classes, ethnicities? And I look forward to it as an opportunity of a more comprehensive politics, rather than a class-based politics or ethnic politics that we have been talking about. Thank you. Just a thought.
Ranobita, you were talking about security as a projection. During COVID, the projection was life is insecure because of health reason. Then we latched upon climate change, or whatever that means. Let's say environmental degradation and all of these ancillaries. But today, when we look at Manipur, Bangladesh, Gaza, life is not made insecure merely by these ancillaries. We have got back to that primordial question that have always plagued security through history. So is security immutable?
Ranveer, I will just raise that brief. But basically, I mean, three brief points. You raised the question of care and the care economy. And now, care economy has again become the central organizing principle of social analysis. And in fact, feminist debates on violence and vulnerability started with talking about the cultural politics of care and the hierarchies of caregiving that women were trapped into. So the history of that entire debate on vulnerability rooted in family and sexual violence, Martha Feynman, for instance, and her work on vulnerability theory. I think that it's really interesting how the entire debate has now centered on what was a marginalized feminist concern. Marginalized because it was a feminist concern on care almost 3 to 4 decades ago. And I think that brings me to the second point, which is that when we are attempting to assemble, assemble ideas, it becomes even more important to historicize our attentiveness to questions of vulnerability. How did that trajectory shift? When did it shift? What were the circumstances under which our attentiveness to vulnerability went one way or another? Now it's COVID, it's public health. Earlier it was family violence, it was sexual violence. So how does that, how and why does that attentiveness shift? And the third and the last point for now is, the relationship between rights, law, and vulnerability. And how has this relationship shifted in relationship to regional politics of various kinds, and in relationship and in relation to the larger historical trajectory of rights discourse itself. So are we talking, what is the relationship between rights and law was a question that came up even in the last workshop. Can we think of rights without law, and is law always rights giving, and so on. Of course, and these are complex questions, but that relationship between rights, law, and vulnerability has not been a seamless, constant relationship either. It's been constantly shifting as well. So I think that basically what I'm pointing to is the need for us to look at these questions and assemble these thoughts with a great deal of historical and other specificities.
Okay, I think let Professor Samadhar respond now to these interventions.
With Kalpana's point, Kalpana, I agree with all that you have said, and I thought that I was trying to historicize the question of security. In fact, this is precisely what I was trying to tell, that there is no all-encompassing, all-weather, all-time definition of the, or understanding of the problematic of security. Security is something which is always being configured by different competing ideas, forces, etc. And something that is important, but something that is fundamental, and in terms of understanding what has changed in the last 20 years or last 30 years. And perhaps, maybe I'm on a bit uncertain ground on this, but perhaps COVID-19 in a way globalized our understanding, partly because it was a global thing, it was a pandemic. There have been other pandemics as well, but in many ways it exposed the fault lines of society in a way that had not been there before, and partly because it no longer remained an exceptional experience, it no longer remained an experience which is subterranean, but it was something that that people experienced, and particularly collectives that depend for their lives on collective care, collective protection. And this is precisely I was alluding to the histories of slums, and that's why I gave that example. That if you write a history of slum, half of it will be the history of fighting fires. And this historian was narrating where he was saying that there were at least 5 to 6 cases of fire outbreak in a slum. A few people died, most of them died, and the whole for where to get water, what to do. So how solidarities grow up, how collectives respond, etc., to the question of the insecurity of life. But something that is, I think, not immutable, but in terms of understanding the vulnerability, is the elephant that is there in the room but we do not see, which is the question of crime. When we speak of security, we never speak of crime. Partly because it's a quote and unquote, and please pardon me, I'm not trying to provoke anybody, so you should allow it to pass. Partly because left people do not think that crime is a great problem. We always think that this is a byproduct of certain things, and if certain things can be taken care of, then crime will be taken care of. But on the other hand, if you think of city, the idea of an enormous dominant experience, which is the urban experience, you cannot think of city without crime. It doesn't mean that in villages there were no crimes. I'm not for a moment satisfied. And you cannot think of crime without a city. And we are all in some way, we are born in urbanity, we are products of the urban world, and we are reproducing that urban world. And how do we fight crime? How do we live with crime? What is the pattern of crime? And how actually lower classes of people coexist, stave off, resist crimes? When I prepared this note, I passed it on to Paula. I said, do you have any comment on that? Paula, if you remember the 2 lines, I incorporated it. So think of just a city that, think of the just saying a simple street. You will find that the most ubiquitous figure on the street is, let us say, the police person. And the police person is always looking at suspiciously at the street vendor or the woman who is soliciting. And the street vendor and the woman who is soliciting, he or she is always looking suspiciously at the police who is looking at her. That is what the configuration of the street is. And how the street is led, how the street lives its life, or how people on the street, they live their life, the more you think of it, the more you will see our notion of crime, our notion of security, our notion of securing ourselves. Think of the petty trader, the hawker, the vendor, all the subaltern populations, or Manish in your near the Dharavi Basti, where you may find part of the living and part of the working, they are in the same place. How do people survive? And the more you think of what the subaltern life in a city is, the more you will see that this is a life where crime, insecurity, disease, and at the same time survival, coalescing, solidarity making, these are things that are making life. And this is a life which will be never secure. And I do not want to name big philosophers and all that, but there is a very famous phrase that we are in a time where we have to learn to live dangerously. You will never live securely. There is no way you can live safely. And how do we learn to live dangerously? We know that we will live, but we know that at each and every moment there is danger that lurks at the corner. How does a collective live? I think this is what I was trying to tell. This is essentially a class question, for that matter, or Manish, that if you think of the subjects of insecurity and if you think of the gated communities, you can well understand. And this is precisely Paula with her few lines when she added to the draft that I sent her, that you look at the architecture of the city, the way streets are made, the way big roads are, think of the way the city is being made and unmade. In the whole making and unmaking of the city, you can see on one hand, you have the whole principle of security at the center of the architect's understanding, but you have another thing. And why do you need security? Well, we don't have to go back to Marx, but simple, again, no rocket science to understand that city is made to make circulation of men, and these days women and children. Earlier it was men. Goods, service and money circulate. The traffic must be kept flowing. There must be no hindrance of traffic. The circulation must be made easy. There must be flow of goods. So take any kind of stretch on the road, you will find 3 ATMs. Next day the concern is, are the ATMs being disturbed? Then Shamulendu the other day will bring some contraption, buy it, so that his credit card or debit card is not pissed off. That is how living, because at every step we conceptualize life along the line of risk, precisely because circulation of economy is the most important concern of society.
I think with those words we conclude this session and we have to move on because we are running late. Thank you very much.
Line with us today, Professor Paula Banerjee. This will be a conversation that will be moderated by Dr. Shamata Bishwas. So I will hand over the mic to her. Thank you.
Thanks, discussant people who are going to have a conversation with each other. So to begin with, very warm welcome. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us, but she's with us in spirit and also on the internet. Professor Meenakshi Gopinath, who we all know about, who is the founder and the current director of WISCOMP, Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, which is an initiative that seeks to promote the leadership of South Asian women in the area of peace, security and regional cooperation. She's also the chair of the Board of Governors at Center for Policy Research, and we know that she was for 26 years the principal of a very, very illustrious college in the capital of India, that is Lady Shri Ram College. Apart from that, Professor Gopinath has been a member of the University Grants Commission. She was the first woman to be nominated to the National Security Advisory Board, and among other, and for those of us who are in higher education, she's also the one who headed the task force of the Saksham report of the University Grants Commission, which initiated several policy reforms on gender equity in higher education. Apart from this, Professor Gopinath has written many things and edited several volumes, but we are not going to go into that. We all know about WISCOMP, which has a very long association with the Calcutta Research Group, and especially in our initial years, WISCOMP, which was established to carry out the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. It promotes multidisciplinary research in the field of peace building with the lens of gender. WISCOMP also offers peace fellowships, and one of the first recipients of that peace fellowship was our very own Professor Paula Banerjee, who we know is currently the IDRC Endowed Chair in Gender and Forced Migration at the Asian Institute of Technology, and a former honorary director of CRG, and also my former vice chancellor at the Sanskrit College and University, and the author of Women in Indian Borderlands and various other books dealing with border security and things that are of concern to us. So without taking any more time, may I request Professor Gopinath to perhaps speak about what we are discussing today, and also the initial years of WISCOMP and the idea of building peace with women alongside women for maybe 7-8 minutes, and then Professor Banerjee can take it up.
Thank you very much indeed. It's really an honor for me to be here in this with this group again, reconnect with some friends. I wish I was there in person. I apologize, there was just a family health emergency, and I'd really like to thank Ranabir for giving me this opportunity to come online. I know it created a lot of technical difficulties, but I just couldn't give up this opportunity without having tried the digital space. And I'm delighted to again reconnect with Paula, albeit virtually, because we have been partners in crime over several, I would say now over 2 decades. And my special greetings to the people around the table, so many of whom are friends and whose work I deeply admire. So thank you very, very much indeed. I thought I might start, with your permission, I know time is short, with a brief sort of telegraphic response to the magisterial, if I want to call it that, or the expansive concept note, and the project that CRG is undertaking, which is ambitious, and I'm truly delighted to see resonances of our early work together around issues of security, where WISCOMP had piloted a study that drew from issues of gender and security across South Asia. So we had studies from Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Kashmir, you name it, Southeast Asia, and of course one on terrorism. And we drew greatly from the insights that Ranabir and Paula so generously gave to us. And as I understand it, the purpose of the MCRG project is to decolonize the concept of security and relocate it in the context of post-colonial society of South Asia, such that is informed by the range of issues and concerns such as food, shelter, education, livelihoods, precarity, and the struggles for justice, and also to ensure that it supports the ecosystem of peace building in our region. I just want us to recall what Ronak Jahan in the 70s, I think, early 70s, late 60s, talked about inner colonialism. And I would just like for us to remember that and kind of visit it in the context of what is going on in our societies today, especially unequal and uneven development. And it's necessary to retrieve the kernel of that idea. The second thing is that you cannot really think of decolonization without pluriversality, and compare it and sort of set it off against the populist predilection. It's not just about human rights, democracy and justice. They are not the only things that are embattled today. As Ranabir mentioned, the entire cultural space that gave birth to a long and steady hybridization of communities, of languages, of art forms is under attack in the name of integration, while the other is being both constructed and pushed towards ghettos. So belief security, cultural security, these are all integral to, I think, what MCRG is attempting to do. Ranabir mentioned the ethics of care. and Kalpana has, of course, written extensively on this. The ethics of care, which is supposed to be integral to this new inclusive social compact, is key to building trust and solidarity to heal our fractured society and the polarization that has beset us. But if we are to speak in a different voice, as Carol Division famously said, countering the new kinds of radicalization that are being spawned by the digital platform is crucial today. It's not just about cybersecurity in the limited sense of understanding security, but it is the digital space that has become so violent today. We were once informed at the turning, shall I say, the advent of what is referred to as globalization, that there would be a better exchange of goods and services. Not just that, but there would also be an exchange of ideas and communication. But today, its discontents are there for all of us to see, and the overweening, pervasive intrusion of McWorld on the one hand, and on the other, the deraffination, the loss of identity, and accompanying atavism in its worst avatar. Dialogue on trust, on the security dilemma, are all being replaced by the legitimization of militarism. Deterrence is finding harsher new articulations, and disarmament is clearly not a goal anymore. We know that today Korea and Japan are ruining their nuclear abstinence. Iran is turning even more bellicose. Moscow and Washington saber rattle, and China is laughing all the way to the bank, although a little less assertively now. We ourselves live in a dangerous environment with two nuclearly armed belligerent neighbors, and therefore the discourse on the need to militarize becomes very compelling when seen through the lens of what we call national security. So we live today in one of the most precarious times, where according to CIPRI, 2023 has seen the largest ever trade in arms, and the wars in Ukraine and Palestine remind us that the hard-earned consensus around the nuclear taboo is no longer even an aspiration. Climate change, as you mentioned, Paula, affects the citizens of our region the most, and the pandemic has blown the lid on the ideas of anthropocentrism and our own invincibility as a species. And in all of this, the slippage between law and justice, niti and nyay, Faizan Saab is here, and he will of course share the absolute mockery that is being made of what is called legal reform through the BNS and the BNSS and of course the Bharatiya Sakshya Adhiniyam, the Evidence Act. How arbitrariness and unaccountable use of power is being normalized, rather legitimized, shrouded in a miasma of verbiage and misleading aphorisms. Here I cannot but recall, and Paula, we've talked about this in our own formulation or reformulation of security through the feminist lens, Mahbubul Haq's famous articulation of security in the Human Development Report, 1994, in such an evocative articulation. He described security as a child who did not die, a disease that did not spread, a job that was not cut, an ethnic tension that did not explode into violence, a dissident who was not silenced. And in the final analysis, he said it's about human life and dignity and not a concern with weapons. National security, as we know, is a pretty recent term coined during the Truman era, influenced largely by behavioralism and structural functional analysis, where the 60s itself as development discourse also was firmly pushed by that. Still, some of the later Marxist perspectives from Petra, Wallenstein, Marcus, Fanon came in to sort of really interrogate that particular construction. But I do want to highlight that the trajectory implicit in Mahbubul Haq's articulation of human security, and it's human security now, yielded three different conceptions of security today. One that focused on the human costs of violent conflict, the other that stressed the human needs in the path of sustainable development, and the third emphasis on the human rights dimension. Of course, we revisit human rights in a completely different way today, and they're not Earlier they used to run parallel to the security discourse. Now is there a convergence is what this project does ask. And for our region, finally, we need to define it, as Huck had said, around the twin axes of freedom from want and freedom from fear. The position paper speaks about labor and the gig economy and the precarity of the unorganized labor force. But can we call it the workforce anymore? Is it really a class either in itself? It's certainly not a class for itself. Today, the nature of the state itself it oscillates between both protector and predator, protector of private capital, neither merely acting at its behest or on its behalf, but implicated and aligned with its interests. Today, the capitalist is a craven supplicant of the state or government, doing its bidding, not the other way around, propagating the state's quest to reinforce power and centralization. While not
Gopinath, I'm so sorry I'm interrupting you. Maybe wrap up in about a minute and we'll come back.
I have a lot. But so coming back again to the WISCOMP experience, I know we need to desecuritize security, and therefore I will yield to Paula. Paula, in our earlier conversations, I think what the feminist approach to security did do was to build upon critical security studies and to look at how its push for emancipation as a prospect of security placed security itself, which was seen somewhat deterministically, within the realm that involved choices and human agency. And the feminist construction, or shall I say, the feminist reinterpretation, the rescripting of security, which both WISCOMP and to some extent your own work highlighted, talked about how the power calculus of real politics did not subserve the vocabulary of interconnectedness, which was so much a part of the feminist project. So you were one of our first and perhaps the shining stars on our firmament on both scholarship and praxis. You, in your study, also brought together women from the Northeast to travel to Sri Lanka, Trincomalee. So what was the compulsion? We feminists, shall I say, understanding of security basically did two things. They interrogated, there was also a subversion involved in it. There was bricolage, and there was building solidarities across borders and boundaries. So how did that reflect in your work, and how has that grown in your own work on displacement today? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gopinath. When we sort of designed the program, we decided that it'll be in the mode of an adda. In Bengal, we are famous for our conversations that I think leads to a lot of interesting ideas, and men get it from what we call the rocks, women get it from supposedly the kitchen, but I think the venue has shifted now, and I keep to my promise that I have nothing scripted. So this conversation will be, as you say, free-flowing. I think you began with a very good question. However, I will say that my concern at that time was that the word security is probably not correct from how we see it, because for me it was a question of insecurity. And I have always tried to say this, that because I probably worked in the borders or in Northeast India, where I saw the predominant paradigm was that of insecurity. So that is why, I will come back with a counter question for you, which again is to me very interesting, is we talked about peace, women, the WPS agenda, which WISCOMP probably started with, and I know we ourselves are deviating from that to a large extent because it did not satisfy any of us ultimately. But, to me what was very interesting at that point of time was, how did you think of, and I know there was a collective thought process there, but I think you were leading that thought process, and in certain ways that led to many paradigmatic changes in thinking among feminists in India, and I have to say that WISCOMP did that. So how did you think of clubbing peace with security? I mean, one can understand conflict, conflict being clubbed with peace. But how did you perceive that it is the question of security that, imbricated on this notion of peace? So can you shed some thoughts on those early years? Because for me, that was very telling.
Thank you. Paula, it's somewhat paradoxical that you of course know that the personal is the political and the personal is also the international in many ways. But the provenance of WISCOMP is a very strange story. And if you have to give me a couple of minutes, I'll try and indulge a personal story in this. You see, I was part of a long-standing Track 2 initiative, which was probably the longest Track 2 initiative between India and Pakistan. It was called the Nimrana Dialogue. And typically we would meet as Track 2 group, sometimes Islamabad, sometimes Lahore, sometimes Delhi, sometimes so on. And then the chair of that particular group from our side said, why don't you write a kind of a paper on how you would envision peace? So, because I was complaining to him about the way the agenda was set, we were talking peace and thinking war, and it was really duplicating Track 1 in many ways, although we were supposedly looking at reconciliation, mediation, and so on. So I went to work, and I thought I did a fairly good job. I presented this paper called Revisioning Peace between India and Pakistan. And do you know what? The only other woman who was from the Pakistani side said, we have just heard an application, a kind of explanation on revisionism and revisionist version of peace. And anyone who has had read any form of Marxism will know that that is a slur word and it's not a happy word. I quickly realized that the entire framing of the discourse on peace was being seen through a zero-sum game lens. And I knew that this was not where I wanted to be for very long, but I continued with that process because, as you have said, national security, shall I say, what you call traditional, conventional security, and what is later described erroneously as non-traditional security are not to be seen as binaries, that they form part of a comprehensive security architecture, and that's what we work towards. So that was, in a sense, the beginning of the setting up of WISCOMP. However, I do want to correct you a bit. We were not really doing the 1325 agenda. We were already there before 1325 was articulated. But we were privy to the many women's movements that created an ecosystem and where 1325 could be articulated. As you know, Bangladesh was the prime mover for 1325. It really came from the global south. And women in our part of the world, the great stalwarts, people like Kumari Jayavardhani, Nighat, Said Khan, there's so many of them, Hamida Hussain, all of them, these stalwarts, these women, had created a palimpsest of transcending conventional borders and boundaries, revisiting one another's realities. And much later, Manmohan Singh said something very interesting which really married these two ideas of conventional and non-conventional approaches to security. He said, no redrawing of boundaries, but making borders irrelevant. But the women in our region had already been doing it. We were doing WPS before the UN woke up to it. And therefore, drawing from that rich reservoir of feminist activism, mobilization, whether it was around work, Kalpana is there, she knows it all, whether it was around work, whether it was against contraception, whether it was a whole range, price rise, the whole range of things, and also their ability to build transversal solidarities. you will remember that the Women Action Forum apologized to the women of Bangladesh for what their military had done to their security. And yet you know how the nation has actually, in some senses, built national honor on the bodies of women, whether it was the Return of Abducted Women's Act, whether it was the Bairanganas in Bangladesh, whether it's Manipur. We've seen this repeated time and time again. So security, as Ronavi said, is kind of construed differently given the context, given the conjuncture, given who is calling the shot and who's framing security. So it was really important for us at that point, Paula, to break out of this framing and reframe it differently as connectedness.
Yeah, thank you. My next conversation point is exactly that, because WISCOMP was a place that I loved at that, and I always do. Why at that point of time? I think it's a great ground for us to get together and speak our minds. However, at that juncture, and I was young and green and rebellious, and when I came to you or you came to me, I was in that rebellious phase. I thought the world is wronging me, and so I was angry. However, WISCOMP made it possible, and I see Ningolo here. That's why it's so telling. We went to Sri Lanka together to talk peace with women in Sri Lanka, and Ningolo was very much there, and that clearly showed that this false gender binaries that we make in questions of peace is problematic. It raises more problems. We should look at it from a much more holistic perspective. But at that point of time, I did not have that perspective. How did you manage to live with, I know, air commodores who used to come to your meetings and talk about national security, and they would pretty much talk about the economy of surveillance. Today, people talked about surveillance, but they did not talk about the economy of surveillance. And I remember somebody even coming to a WISCOMP meeting and saying, and I raised the question that, okay, you two men will meet in the borders, what would women do? So he said, we can arrange for a song and dance festival. And I remember both you and me were like, we were not cringing, we were ready to beat up people at that point of time. So how did you manage to work with that, that overwhelming paradigm, and also bring in young women from Pakistan, the school children, and I distinctly remember my conversations with them, and the first thing that attracted me was this young girl telling me that, coming to India was an eye-opener, not her words, my words, because people here look just like us. So, these two paradigmatic worlds were so different, yet WISCOMP somehow could bring them together. How did you manage to do that balancing?
Okay, one of the things that your exposition paper highlights is dialogue, and bringing seemingly opposite worldviews to search for common ground by recognizing differences but building on commonalities. So it'll always have to be that. I hate to put it this way, but today what we are seeing as the bellicosity of the right could also have something to do with having felt completely excluded in dialogue with some aspects of or actually questioning some aspects of their premises. So dialogue is not a happy backslapping kind of thing. It's about ironing. It's about being able to disagree without being disagreeable. And you're right. The generals and the bureaucrats did bring a certain patronizing spirit to the room. But if you don't include them in your discussions, you're leaving out the people who are unfortunately still calling the shots. And when national security is being counterposed to people's security, it was important for us. And you will remember that steadily over the years, from being called to be part of the last panel on the last day, just before, after the tea break, we inched our way into the general format of agenda setting. It's a long and arduous task. Now, for example, our work in Kashmir. As you said, we worked in Kashmir. Siddiq has been, as again, a partner in crime there. When we first worked, we were asked, what is your agenda? Whose agenda are you here to sort of realize? We said, look, the lack of agenda is our agenda. The lack of resources is our greatest wealth. And we stayed, it's very important in this kind of work to stay a little bit below the radar and not to shout what you do from the rooftops. Just like any reconciliation process that we engage in between the so-called majority and minorities in our country has to be done non-paternalistically. Active listening is important, and I think that's something that CRG is trying to do in this whole with this whole issue. Winning trust is a 2 steps forward, maybe 10 steps back, but staying the course, because peace it's a kaleidoscope. It could be broken bangles. It could be looking through a particular silhouette. It could be it's there today. It's not an end game. It's work in progress every day. And here I want to come back to this. Everyday mutinies and daily resistances are important. They don't have to be great acts like Rosa Parks being thrown off the bus, but everyday mutinies and daily resistances, because you have in your program identified the quotidian, the everyday insecurities placed by, I hate to use this word, but you haven't used it, but it's there implicit in your text, by the Lilliputian population, because the Gullivers are there waiting to swallow the Lilliputians. I don't want to be putting an antagonistic kind of thing, but it's the everyday, the quotidian that has to be worked on, where the feeling of insecurity is so palpable that it is in every. I remember getting on a bus in Delhi, and you know what happens to women who get on a bus in Delhi, and there was this woman who would come on. She was clearly from a rural environment, neither rural nor urban, but the rural environment, carrying her stack with her. And I later met her off the bus stand and asked her, how do you manage to do this day in and day out? And she said, har mahila ko apni rajniti banani padti hai. How do you bricolage around it? How do you find spaces? How do you pry open spaces? And in this context, I do want to say, we must not romanticize rural life or even the slum life, because it's an everyday struggle, competitive struggle for survival, for access to very limited and retreating resources, for a state that has retreated on the one hand and is omnipotent on the other hand. It's like, the 18th Brumaire, a state that has become a Bonapartist state. It is an excrescence in society, where the old order hasn't died, and yet it is crumbling, and the new order has not found its articulation. So there is this constant, shall I say, navigation, negotiation, and above all, a deep, deep sense of humility with which one has to approach this very difficult terrain.
Thank you so much.
I just want to interject for half a minute. Runaway talked about the architecture of the city. And today we have the grotesque, I'm sorry to use that word, the reconstruction of the imperial city of Delhi into what is known as the Central Vista Project, which is modeled on the Champs-Élysées or Moscow or Imperial Moscow. That's the kind of thing that is. Look at and what's happened in Varanasi, that the street vendors, the julahas, the weavers, they've all disappeared from view. So that is the nature of the modern city, and crime will be integral to it, as you said. But I'm sorry, I've strayed a little from the path of security.
This question to me was very, very important, and I'm glad ultimately we had the occasion to talk about it, because I admire you greatly, and I know I can never be a Meenakshi Gopinath, but with that panache. But thank you so much for your elegant answer, as always. But you in our conversation yesterday or day before, we were discussing how WISCOMP has now, its conception of security has gone beyond what it was at that point of time. So is this change post-COVID? And how do you evaluate the question of security now, especially for women? Because I think security is very locational. And the reason why I say this, I'm going to take just 2 minutes, because just now to Ranavid's exposition, Orupta asked the class question. And this is very, very sort of within this question, because I was trying to take my domestic help to Thailand, because I thought she's been with us for a long time. She deserves a holiday. So I was trying to get her a passport exactly at the time when I was renewing my passport. My passport was renewed in 3 days' time. And my maid was there with me when she submitted her documents, so that went seamlessly. But then she had to go for police verification. She had all the papers. The police were horrible to her. I asked her pretty much, that same question, that were they big officers? They said, no, they are from our strata of society. So the same class. But their documents were, for some reason delayed to the extent that she just could not go with me. She had told them that they have bought my tickets and I need to go, or otherwise I will lose this chance. But she got her passport. They couldn't deny her that because she had all her documents. So how is the class question today impacting on the gender question? Would it have been different if it was a man? Do we see gender differently today? Or, or are we still battling with the same questions where class is always in contradiction with gender?
Oh, that's a question. That's a great question. I think we'll need to spend hours discussing this. Paula, class is not going away. We may not designate it. We may not talk about it. I mean, with sort of Marxist articulations being given the backseat everywhere, and I'm not making a case that we have to go back to a reductivist understanding, but class is omnipresent in our society. And we know, for example, when we talk of women, we are not talking about women as in reductivist terms, because your location, your class, your caste, the region you come from will all determine the nature of your power or powerlessness, your powerfulness or your powerlessness. And therefore, we cannot do away with this category. I think it would be very short-sighted for us to attempt. Now, let me just go back again to the security issue. You remember when we did this project together and there were 5 other partners, we were talking about the issue of what was called then non-traditional security. And this whole idea of NTS was really an imperial, shall I say, a kind of first world idea that was being sought to be sold to us in the so-called global south. Today, of course, the global south and the north coexist within national boundaries everywhere. Not perhaps with a few exceptions of some of the Nordic countries, but even there it's becoming. Let's realize global north and global south coexist within national boundaries across the world today, for a variety of reasons, migration being one of them. In those days, what was considered non-traditional security was for the so-called third world like us, or the global south like us. It was about water, it was about hunger, it was about poverty, it was about access to land, it was about a whole range of things. And traditional security was, of course, for the powerful. It was about weapons and so on and so forth. Which is why, when you spoke about circles of insecurity, how macro security creates micro insecurities, we changed the paradigm completely. And we said, listen, hold on, what you are calling NTS are really the perennial security concerns of 3/4 of the world's population. So what are you talking about? Now let's not forget Stephen Cohen. Let's not forget the Ford Foundation at that time. Let's not forget all the institutions that were set up ended with SS, whether it was RCSS, whether it was in Bangladesh, what was it called? BIS, BISS. All of these had the same provenance, which was originated by the imagination of a Stephen Cohen. Now, Stephen Cohen is a wonderful guy. He does great work on South Asia. But let's go back to the original source of this idea. And we said, hold on, no. NTS, what you call NTS, are our perennial security concerns. And therefore, we talked about non-traditional formulations of security. Today, thanks to what is called the SDGs, or thanks to the work of the Brundtland Commission, even going as far back as the Brandt Commission and Olaf Palme's work, we know that the twain has met. Today, you do not talk about security issues without talking about so-called sustainable development goals. But even there, the MDGs were a very colonial articulation. It was all about how the global south had to improve. It had to improve poverty, it had to improve illiteracy, it had to get out of the rut of disease. Today, because of the imperatives or inconvenient truth of climate change, the global north, if you want to call it that, has woken up to the fact that there are shared but differential responsibilities. And therefore, you have a much wider notion about how this compact, this global compact, is about development and environment and security conspiring to build peace. Today, we cannot talk about any kind of security that doesn't have gender as a component, that doesn't have environment, that doesn't have development as a component. So we've come a long way. One last word, that is women. When we talk about women, and it's there in your notes, let's not talk only about their vulnerabilities. We want to get out of the victimology discourse. Let us look at where they have agency. I found that even in the concept note, we're looking at women as vulnerable. And we must only not look at the triply and doubly disadvantaged women, and the role of the state as protector to some and predator as far as others. This oscillating role of the state. So let us now recognize that in many ways, because of the interventions even by the UN and primarily by the women of the erstwhile global south, the notion of security has been reconfigured, rescripted. We need to build on it. We need to add the ethics of care. We need to humanize security, as was done earlier. So, and the woman issue today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gopinath. Sorry, but I've already got 3 chits from the organizers.
One last thing. Let's not, the woman issue today, with all the range of things that we have about pronouns and the gender spectrum, can we afford to just talk about women?
Yeah,
I'm just leaving that with
you.
Thank you.
No, believe you me, we will definitely not look at women as victims, and that is not the intention at all. In fact, I begin my gender and migrant labor class by talking about the young man in Singapore, the Indian guy who was literally killed because there was some suspicion that he was involved in the narcotics business, and there was no proof of that. I'm sure if it was a woman migrant labor, this would not have happened. It would not have been so easy to kill him. So we recognize that we have an edge in a lot of places, but how do we negotiate with that edge? Because in the meta discourse, we are still peripheral. However, there are heartening signs. Last night, when I was watching the opening ceremony of the Olympics, their enforced use of women in that, women of letters also. So that was heartening to a way, but my sister was saying it's tokenism, blah, blah, blah. But isn't that where we always begin, tokenism? And then we make our own space. Then we create our own history. But that's not a question. I know people are going to gun me down after this. I'm dealing with the male security apparatus here. And so thank you so much, Dr. Gopinath. We really wish you were here with us, because we could have had a long, long time for that long-awaited Adda. We have to do it soon. And yes, Samuta, you will otherwise snatch it from me. Thank you, Dr. Gopinath.
Paula, may I just end with saying that famous thing from Audre Lorde, that the master's house can never be dismantled by the master's tools. So we have to look for new tools. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think we are supposed to break for tea now, and we'll meet after that. Thank you.